Okay, so we are jumping into chapter 4 today of the Teshuva. The treatise, an essay on Teshuva. So I wouldn't say got carried away, but the Alter Rebbe did digress to explain to us not only the legal definition of Teshuva, but also to explain the parameters of Teshuva and what's kind of beyond Teshuva, which is the where does fasting come in? That was something we focused on over chapters 2 and 3, but now chapter 4 will get back into the soul of the idea, which is the teshuva, the way it is relevant for me and you. So that's going to take us on page 59. Let me just pause this for a second. Okay, so we're starting chapter 4, page 59, if you're looking in the book, but I have it up on the screen. This is getting back into the theme over here of Teshuva, but we're going to delve deeper in what's the mystical dimension of Teshuva and how it's affecting the higher world through our power of Teshuva. God's name in your soul is a chapter title. In section 1 over here is some questions on Teshuva. In chapters 2 and 3, the Tanya has digressed to discuss the atonement and post-atonement role of fasting. In this chapter, we will return to our central theme, which is Teshuva. Before probing deeper into the spiritual dynamic of Teshuva, the Tanya will first pose some questions from the texts on our subject. And good morning, Michelle. However, all the above we have learned in chapters 2 and 3 about fasting and charity is to complete atonement and cleanse the soul to God after Teshuva. As has been explained above from the Talmud Tractate Zvachim, chapter 1, that the burnt offering is a gift after the mediator has made his plea. Now let's jump into Teshuva. However, the beginning of the mitzvah of Teshuva and its main thrust is to return to God authentically with the whole heart, as we have explained in chapter 1. This now requires more extensive clarifications from Jewish mystical sources. Let us begin with a teaching from the Holy Zohar, which explains that the word teshuva mystically is tashuv hey, return the letter hey. So let's just read it, the introduction over here, and then hopefully we'll recall what we learned last week and the name of God, the way I pulled it up on the screen. But let's just see it inside the way the translator over here explains it. The tshuva has
I
restorative
don't
power.
see the screen at all.
Oh, I think you were saying that last week, but Naomi, you're able to see the screen? You could just nod your head. You could see it, right? Um, so there's something somewhere on your screen, Freda, that you would be able to pull it up. I'm not sure. Are you able to see me?
Yes, yes, I see,
Uh,
but I
okay.
don't see the screen. And if I, it's just incomprehensible. I used to be able to see it.
Yeah. All right.
Okay,
I guess until you can figure it out, you could listen. I'll try to speak slower, so maybe you could not only read it, but you could listen with me. But it
okay,
should be
so
on the screen there somewhere.
yeah,
Teshuva, I love this line. Teshuva has restorative powers. It heals the soul of the penitent, and it rectifies spiritual energies in the divine realm that were damaged by the sin. So again, we have a sin, there's a damage that takes place, and Teshuva not only heals the soul, but it also rectifies the energies that were then fragmented as a result of the sin. God's most sacred name, which is the Tetragrammaton, spelled Yud Hey, followed by a Vav Hey, as we will see later in the chapter, can be read as a code depicting the energies in the divine realm. The damage to these worlds is described metaphorically as a fragmentation of the Tetragrammaton, when its component letters become disconnected from each other. Specifically, it is the letter Hey which becomes dislocated through sin. Teshuva is the process by which the Hey is restored to the Tetragrammaton and incorporated back in it. This is hinted to by the word Teshuva itself, which is the combination of two words, Tashuv, Hey, meaning returning the letter Hey. The letter Hey appears twice in the Tetragrammaton, hinting to two levels of Teshuva. So I just want to highlight, I wish I could zoom in. I don't think I can over here, but I'm just highlighting on the word Teshuva. So if you look at the word Teshuva, you could also break it up. whoops. You could also break it up to read a tashuv hey, which means to return the hey. And what we're learning now is God's name has a yud, hey, vav, and hey. There's two letters, hey. There's two heys in the name God, in the name Havaya, in the God's name. So what we're trying to do is return the hey back in and incorporate it back into God's name. And really, there's two heys. So there's two levels of teshuva. There's the returning of the lower hey, the last letter hey of God's name, and there's a returning of the higher hey, which is the second letter of God's name. So, in general, when a person sins, they're making a damage, they're making a fragmentation in the letter hey of God's name. So when you do teshuva, what we're trying to do is repair that fragmentation and bring the letter hey of God's name back into the name. So tashuv hey means return the letter hey of God's name back into its source. Restoring the last lower hey of the tetragrammaton is lower teshuva. Restoring the first upper hey of the tetragrammaton is upper teshuva. So that's from Rabbi Chaim Vital, who brings it in the gates of teshuva. While we have touched upon these two levels of teshuva in part one, they will be more central to the discussion in Igaras Teshuva. Later, we will explain them in detail, as well as the meaning of each of the four letters of the tetragrammaton. First, the Tanya will ask another question on one of the Zohar's teachings, which seems to limit the power of teshuva. So let's ask the question. We also need to clarify the Zohar statement in a few places that teshuva is not effective for sexual sins, which is blemishing of the covenant, or for the sin of emitting semen in vain, which is a very shocking statement. For we have been taught that nothing stands in the way of teshuva, which is from the Jerusalem Talmud, even the most serious violations of idol worship and forbidden relations and murder. How can the Zohar claim that teshuva to be ineffective in any scenario? So we always learn that teshuva works even for the most dire, for the gravest of sins, like idol worship. But yet it says that there's certain sins like immorality, which is known as pogain brito, which is blemishing the covenant, and emitting sin in vain. Those things are teshuva can't affect. So that's a question that we're having on the Zohar. So that's a very famous question. So an answer given is by the Reishis Chachma. Reishis Chachma is an incredible work of Musar and Kabbalah that was I forgot the author, but there's parts of the Reishis Chachma that is studied by a groom before a wedding. Before a groom gets married, the Chabad custom is to study parts of Reishis Chachma, and he explains as follows: that what the Zohar means to say is that when he says teshuva is ineffective, he's talking about lower teshuva is ineffective for sexual sins, for emitting seed in vain. And higher teshuva is required in this case. But this requires further explanation. So this matter will not be fully clarified until chapter 9. First, we will probe the meaning of teshuva more deeply. And good morning, Lynn. So just to clarify this point, it's a powerful question. In the Jerusalem Talmud, let's just clarify it again. In the Jerusalem Talmud, it says that nothing could stand in the way of teshuva. Teshuva works for everything. That's not the words. It says even for a sin that's considered a cardinal sin, which is um, an act of immorality, which is adultery, and idol worship, and murder. Even teshuva works for that because nothing can stand in the way of teshuva. And just to appreciate that a little more, just how grave these sins are that teshuva works on, we know that for most mitzvahs in the Torah, a person has to fulfill. But if their life um, is in danger, they don't have to fulfill it. So if a person is, let's say, dying of hunger, they don't have to eat kosher at that point. They should save their life. Or if Shabbat, if a person is sick on Shabbat and they have to go to the hospital, you have to violate Shabbat. It's actually the obligatory thing is to violate Shabbat. And the logic is because keep yourself alive and you'll be able to fulfill many more Shabbats. So, but there's three sins that a person has to be ready to sacrifice their life and not commit those sins. And that's idolatry, adultery, and murder. So that's how grave these sins are, that a person has to be ready to die for them. Those three sins. And yet, when it comes to teshuva, it works even for that. Teshuva cleanses even a person who, God forbid, committed idolatry, for example. So that's what we know from the Jerusalem Talmud, which is a very standard concept of teshuva. But yet, in the Zohar, it explains that acts of immorality teshuva does not work for. It can't cleanse an act of immorality. It just because it's so deep in a person that the teshuva can't reach there, something like that. So that's obviously a contradiction. So what the Alter Rebbe just answered, sorry, from the Alter Rebbe just quoted from the Reishis Chachma, which is an incredible work that's I think 800 years old or so, that the lower part of teshuva does not work to affect it. That's what the Zohar says, that it doesn't, teshuva doesn't work for an act of immorality. It's talking about a lower level of teshuva. But a higher level of teshuva does work. That does cleanse. And that's like what the Talmud was talking about, that even an act of idolatry, adultery, and murder is teshuva is effective for. So we didn't clarify what is lower teshuva and what is higher teshuva, but what we see from here is that there are two levels of teshuva. And therefore, when you look at God's name, as we did last week, and I pulled it up on the screen, um, the word teshuva itself, you could read it as tashuv hey, which means return the letter hey of God's name. That when there is a sin, it makes a fragmentation in God's name. Which part of God's name is the letter hey? The letter hey of God's name is more the letter of God's name that is about creating in the world, about expansiveness, about relating to the world. So when a person sins, there's a spiritual energy that has been exiled and that has been removed from God's name. So that's the letter hey that has been touched, that has been abused. So by you doing teshuva, you are elevating or you are redeeming or freeing the letter hey back into God's name. But there's two letter heys in God's name. There's yud and then a hey, and then there's vav and then a hey. There's just two heys. So the lower teshuva affects the last letter hey of God's name. The higher teshuva affects the second letter, which is the first hey of God's name. So what we see from the Jerusalem Talmud, combining it with the Zohar, is that there are two levels of teshuva. A lower teshuva, which is effective of the lower hay of God's name, and a higher teshuva, which is affecting the first hay of God's name. So teshuva could also be read as tashuv hay, which is to return the hay, whether the lower hay, the higher hay, it's referring to the lower teshuva or the higher teshuva. Okay, but now we're going to ask a very famous question. I'm going to it's a question that could bother so many people. And over here, the Alter Rebbe is not going to answer it, but we're going to ask it. It's a very good question, and we're going to see the answer, I think, later in this chapter. In order to understand Teshuva a little more, we're on the third paragraph over here. Let us first turn to some comments from Scripture and our sages about charis and death through the agency of heaven. As we learned in chapter 1, the violation of a Torah prohibition carries a stated penalty. Two of the most severe of these are a divinely imposed cutting, what's in Hebrew known as charis of the soul, and death through the agency um, of heaven. Okay, so we know while we don't really focus on it much, in temple times, there was different punishments for a person who violated a sin. Obviously, if it was done unintentionally, it would just be bringing, not just, but a person would have to bring a sacrifice, an offering in the temple. But there were other punishments depending on the sin. There were other penalties that were put in place. Some of them were more spiritually oriented, which means a person who committed a certain sin would have death in the hands of heaven, which means no court could put them to death, either because there was no witnesses or because they can't prove anything, but it would be death from the hands of heaven, which means usually it would mean a person would pass away by the age of 60. And it's pretty heavy ideas, but there is a concept of capital punishments in Torah. We don't have it anymore, but when there was a Supreme Court, there was a concept of it's called misas bested, which means the court would put a person to death if they violated a certain sin. And there was four general ways of putting a person to death. In Hebrew, they're known as sreifa, skila, hareg, and Fennec, which seems pretty intense. And there was through burning. It wasn't actually that they burnt the person, but it was actually they would put a hot lead into the person, and it would burn their insides. There was a concept of stoning. There was cutting off a person's head, and there was strangulation. So those were the four. But now a person, um, it says a court who would, they were more not preventative. What's the word? But it says a court that would administer a punishment, a capital punishment, once in 70 years was considered a bloodthirsty court. And I think I mentioned that previously. So it's pretty rare or very rare for any of these to actually happen, but that's the way it is in the Torah. But now, if a person wasn't able to be put to death, either because there were no witnesses or because he wasn't warned, it was very hard to put someone to death. It was almost impossible. So the court wasn't able to do it, but the person would die by a penalty administered by God. So either, God forbid, the person would drown, and it was almost like a strangulation where he couldn't breathe anymore, or a person would be in an accident, and there were things, or a person would fall off a ladder, God forbid. So it was like a way of like a stoning. There was different punishments that would not be by the hands of courts, rather it'd be by the hands of heaven. So that's called misas bidei shemayim. And then there was also the concept of a karis, which literally means cut off. That a person, they would pass away by the age of 60. So those are pretty intense ideas, but the Alter Rebbe is going to ask a very foundational question. So karis means a person is cut off. It means they die by the age of 60. According to some opinions, it would mean that they die childless, God forbid. Not according to all opinions, but according to some. But the Tanya now explores the physical consequences of receiving these punishments in more detail. For a transgression whose punishment is karis, in earlier times, the transgressor would actually die physically before reaching the age of 50. And for a transgression whose punishment is death through the agency of heaven, he would literally die physically before reaching the age of 60. While karas and death through the agency of heaven may seem to be spiritual punishments, since they are not administered by the earthly court, the Tanya notes that in earlier times, these punishments would have a very physical consequences of premature death. An example of this is in the case of Hananiah ben Azur, who was the false prophet mentioned in Jeremiah and Yirmiyahu. Hananiah ben Azur was initially an authentic prophet. He later became guilty of false prophecy, saying, "Thus speaks the God of hosts, the God of Israel, saying, I have broken the yoke of the king of Babylon. Within 2 full years will I bring again in this place all the vessels of God's house that Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, took away from this place and carried them to Babylon." This contradicted Jeremiah's correct prophecy that the temple was to be destroyed. Jeremiah subsequently informed Hananiah ben Azur of a message he had received from God, conveying a punishment. Therefore, this is what God says: "Behold, I will cast you from off the face of the earth. This year you shall die." The verse stresses that this was God who said, "I will cast you off," indicating that this death was through the agency of heaven. Indeed, we find that the punishment materialized physically, and Hananiah, the prophet, died the same year. So we learned above that a transgression whose punishment is death through the agency of heaven, a person would literally die physically before reaching the age of 60. Why then did Hananiah ben Azur die the same year? So the Talmud explains, and occasionally death through the agency of heaven is even administered immediately, as in the case of Er and Onan. Er and Onan, who were the sons of Yehuda, the son of Jacob, were evil in the eyes of God for wasting their seed, which is punishable by death through the agency of heaven, and were put to death immediately by God. This was, however, in biblical times. The Tanya now questions why we do not find these punishments administered from heaven in later generations. This is problematic since there are countless individuals throughout history who performed acts punishable by karis or death by the agency of heaven, and yet have lived long, happy lives. If the lives of these individuals have been miserable, one might argue that they have received a punishment somehow equivalent to death. But how do we understand that in place of death through agency of heaven, a person would live a long, happy life? So this question is a very powerful one. It's quite a heavy subject. I think someone changed the initial language. 1 second. Interesting. Okay. It's a pretty heavy question. And again, the question is that if there's a concept of paris, which is cutting off of the soul, and misa bidei shamayim, which is death in the hands of heaven, even though those took place in temple times, but you would imagine that even nowadays, a person who would be punishable by those deaths during temple times would at least live a very hard life now. But what we see is that people that carry those sins are not only not punished, but we see they could actually live happy lives. They get away with crimes, with sins, and there's no punishment at all. If anything, you see they're living it up, as we would say. They're totally living a happy life, even though it's been a very crooked life. So the Alter Rebbe wants to know, how could that be? If there was a sin and it was punishable a certain way. So in temple times, those would be punishable by dying by the age of 60. And there were even circumstances in biblical times when they were punished immediately. But nowadays, not only do we see that they don't carry that punishment, we actually see that they're actually living a life full of a bounty, full of abundance. And so the Alter Rebbe wants to know, how could that be? So I see just two Hasidic thoughts on page 60 in this section, on page 60 in chapter 4 of this book. So I just want to read it. One is from a letter of the Rebbe from 1956, from 5716. And the Rebbe says like this: there can be no question that Teshuva is effective in every case and whatever the transgression. For Teshuva is one of God's commandments, and God does not require of us the impossible. So and originally what we were saying is that there's, even though in the Zohar it seems that there is a certain sin, like of immorality, that the tshuva can't affect. What the Alter Rebbe answers from Reishas Chachma is that of course it could affect it. Maybe the lower teshuva can't affect it, but the higher teshuva, which we will discuss and explore, definitely can improve and repair the fragmentation caused through that sin. And like we see from this letter of the Rebbe, that if the tshuva itself is a mitzvah, of course it can be fulfilled because God wouldn't ask of us the impossible. So if there's a mitzvah, of course it's available and accessible for us to be able to fulfill. And on page 62, just one more Hasidic thought before we continue. Whoever transgresses the commandments of Torah, it is as if he damages above and damages below. He damages himself and damages all worlds. This may be compared to sailors sitting side by side on a ship, when one fool among them stands up and decides to drill a hole. So that's from the Zohar, which is obviously such a famous example that a person who's digging a hole on a ship, you have to stop him because he's not only ruining his own life, he's putting everyone's life in danger. So the same is also through a sin. He's not only damaging his own soul, he's making a damage for the whole world. And therefore it affects us all. So you could see the weight or with the heaviness of every sin that is being committed. Okay, so now we'll continue inside unless we have any questions. In section 2, the soul's root. So we're on the bottom of the Kindle page. We're on page 63 if you're looking inside as we continue. To answer these questions, yeah, go ahead, Lynn.
So really what's happening is we were talking about repairing the fragmentation and the exile. It's elevating God's name because it says you shall not take the name of Hashem in vain, but when you act in a vain way, you've really taken the name in vain. And so as a holy nation, you're restoring and you talk about the ship and the hole in it, that you're restoring the holiness to the nation. So is that what the Teshuva is really about, is returning God's name and the holiness to it as the way that we behave? And you said returning the, repairing the fragmentation, or repairing repairing the exile.
Yeah, because there's a spiritual energy in everything we do, and that spiritual energy is now being exiled into the act that was done, and therefore there's a repair that needs to happen in your soul. And we spoke about that. That's the basics of Teshuvah in chapter 1. And then there's the gift that you do beyond the Teshuvah, which is like the mediator that asks for forgiveness and gives a gift on behalf of the servant who was fired by the king. And that would be like fasting or giving an offering in the olden days. But now the deeper part of Teshuvah is not only what you did to yourself, is what you did to the spiritual energy, to the godliness and the name of God that has been fragmented. So exactly, when a person does Teshuvah, the Teshuvah has to be a way to repair that fragmentation. So there's a lower Teshuvah that could only repair the lower fragmentation, which is on the last letter Hey of God's name. And then there's going to be the higher Teshuvah, which is to repair the higher the deeper fragmentation, which is on the second letter of God's name, the first Hey. Yeah.
So like all the prophets, like you mentioned Jeremiah, the desire of the prophets was really, if you could sum it up, was really Teshuvah. I mean, that was their main goal, was come back to God. Is that what you would say?
So some of them more than others. Like I would take Elisha, I would say, was less of a Teshuvah, less of a Teshuvah prophet than Elijah, than his teacher. I would say Elijah, he spent so much time working on inspiring or encouraging, and at a certain point, he basically gave up. But he had a big showdown with the false prophets. I would take Jonah as the prototype of Teshuvah prophet, where the famous, I mean, the whole book of Jonah is about God's command to him to go to Nineveh, um, uh, the Assyrian rule, and to get them to mend their evil ways, to do Teshuvah. And he actually tried to run away from doing that. So I would say there's some prophets that were more, definitely Jeremiah, and Isaiah was, the idea of Teshuvah for Isaiah. I think I don't know. I'm not an expert on the prophets, but Yeshayahu was more um, of a redemptive type of prophet, where he was reminding the Jewish people that there's good to come, that there's, even though we've been so broken, there's he would prophesy about the time to come. He would prophesy about returning. It was more not so much about the rebuke and mend your ways, more than it was. I think it was more about seeing the good that is waiting for us if we do the right thing. Does that make sense? So again, I'm not an expert on the prophets, but there's some more than others. But this is interesting. Hananiah ben Azur that we just mentioned over here, he was an authentic prophet until he turned, which is crazy to think that you could be an authentic prophet and still having that blessing of being able to speak to God or hear God's voice, and yet still manage to become a false prophet. That's a next level, I would say, um, because most of us, we could claim we don't know what God, we didn't hear God's message. Person who hears it so directly and still turns on it, it's like yeah, pretty heavy.
Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, what do you say?
Thank you. Yeah. And,
Yeah,
and prophets had to have a record of 100%, or they were false. It's in
exactly.
Deuteronomy. Yeah.
And then it was punishable by death if they were false. There was no I don't think there was teshuva at that point, right? Which is interesting. um yeah, so let's see it inside. To answer these questions, we need to understand the teshuva process more deeply. Again, the question is, how could it be that a person who would be punishable by death in the hands of heaven, which means they would die by the age of 50 or 60, why do we see them living such good lives? How could that be? So I think that's a very powerful question. Um, but to understand that, we first have to understand the deeper parts of Teshuvah. Tanya will begin with a discussion of the soul and its unique origin. So now, to get to Teshuvah, And to answer the question, we first have to get into the soul. The Tanya has already taught in part 1, chapter 2, that the soul in the Israelite is a piece of God above. In Hebrew, the words were Thelek Elokah Mimal, which is from Job. And then the Alter Rebbe added the word mamash, which means literally. We return to this theme. So this is a very powerful idea that we started the whole book of the book 1 of Tanya, with the idea that we have a godly soul. But now, to understand Teshuva, we have to get back into the godly soul dynamic. We can explain all this by first examining the verse. For God's portion are his people, etc. Okay, so this is a verse in Deuteronomy. This is, if I'm not mistaken, from the Torah portion of Hazinu, which is towards the end of the not if I'm not mistaken, it's from the portion of Hazinu, which is the 32nd chapter of the book of Deuteronomy, second to last, fourth to last Torah portion of the part of the Torah. No, sorry, second to last Torah portion of the Torah, where God says, "Chelek Havaya Amo," that Havaya portion are his people. So the way the Alter Rebbe explains this is as follows, which implies that God's people are a portion of the blessed divine name Havaya. So look at the words again. Chelek Havaya. Havaya is God's name, the Tetragrammaton, as we pronounce it nowadays, without it being a holy name, is Havaya, but really it's a Yud, Hey, Vav, and Hey. Chelek Havaya Amo. That Havaya's portion are his people. So it seems like, if we're understanding that correctly, that we, the Jewish people, God's people, are a portion, are chelek of the name Havaya, which is the Tetragrammaton. The divine origins of the soul are hinted to in Deuteronomy in this chapter. The Havaya's portion is read hyper literally. God's people, the verse tells us, contain a soul which is actually a portion of Havaya. So the soul that we have is a portion of Havaya. As we have noted previously, Havaya is a term used to denote the Tetragrammaton, God's four-letter name, spelled Yud, Hey, followed by a Vav and Hey. Since this name is too sacred to pronounce, it is denoted by saying the word in inverse, which is Havaya. Instead of starting with a Yud, we switch it around and therefore it becomes Havaya. The description of the soul as literally divine and a portion of God is striking, since Jewish teachings are usually careful to emphasize a sharp distinction between the Creator and his creations. Rabbi Chaim Vital explains, the soul's light arises and flows from the light of the 10 Sephiras, which is the divine powers themselves, without any intermediary, which is why the verse states, you are children of God, your God. Which in Hebrew the term is banim atem lashem elokechem. For the soul is like a child who is completely attached to his father, from whom his being flows, from whom his being flows. The Tanya reiterates the sources of this idea stated in part 1. As the verse states, and God blew into his nostrils the breath of life. And one who blows from his innards. As the Tanya explains that God blew from the innermost depths of his being, for when a person blows forcibly, he exhales with a deep-rooted inner energy. The biblical metaphor of blowing man's soul suggests that God has a deep inward attachment to the soul, as opposed to the rest of creation, which arose through the more superficial speech of God, like it says, God said, let there be light, etc. Okay, so while God has no semblance of a body, God forbid, so God's blowing is clearly not meant in a physical sense. Nevertheless, the Torah speaks of God in human terms, employing the metaphor of blowing to imply a deep spiritual attachment. The Tanya elaborates, for just as, for example, the intensity of breath coming from the mouth of a mortal human differs greatly between speaking and blowing, for when he speaks, only a minuscule amount of power energy is invested, meaning that speaking is a superficial expression of a living soul within him, Whereas when he blows powerfully, it comes from inside himself, expressing a deep power, energy of his living soul, etc. The same is true, figuratively speaking, with God. Although the comparison is obviously an utterly inadequate one, since a human being is infinitely removed from God. So let's just pause here for a second and explain a couple of ideas over here. So what we're explaining over here is that the neshama, which is the soul, literally comes from Hashem, comes from God. And obviously that could sound a little off because we're not God. So what we're explaining is the root of our soul is coming from the 10 divine energies, which in Hebrew is called the 10 sefirot, that directly flows from God. And from those 10 sefirot, it flows and it makes the anatomy, it makes the DNA of our neshama. So therefore, our soul literally is coming from the insides of God. It's flowing from the divine energies of godliness. And like we see that when God created the world, he created everything with speech. And yet when he created the neshama, he created it through breath, which is coming from the deeper inner part of God, similar to the way we speak. We speak with an outer part of ourselves, but when we blow from and exhale, we do that from a deeper part of our part, and therefore we get exhausted after doing that much quicker than after speaking. Let's just
That's
read. Go ahead. I just want to read the practical lesson. Um, unless I, oh no, I guess you know what. Let's take the question first. I think it's on the next page if I understand that. Yeah, go ahead, Lynn. Sorry.
That's Genesis 2:7. And the Lord God formed man of the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life.
Yeah,
And man became uh, he became a living being. So he became a nefesh chaya
yeah.
after the breathing.
And the Zohar quotes on that verse and says, and the Zohar takes that verse and it says, Nishmat Chayim, Vayifach Ba'apav Nishmat Chayim, and he says, Man denafach, whoever blows, to exhale, you have to blow from the inner part of a being. So obviously, God doesn't have real breath that we're putting in human terms, but it's the idea that it's coming from the inner part of God is where the neshama comes from, as opposed to the rest of creation, which comes from an outer part of God. So now that we establish the root of the soul, we could go on in explaining our very makeup, which is coming from the 10 sefirot of godliness, the 10 spiritual energies. The Tanya explains the difference between the energetic content of God speaking and his blowing. So we're like in the middle of the Kindle page. Where are we up to inside? I think we're on the 64. That sounds right. Above, in the spiritual realms, there is a radical difference between the divine energy invested in the hosts of the heaven, which is the angels, even the angels, and the divine energy invested in the soul. The angels were created something from nothing by God's speech, meaning that they are energized and sustained from an external flow of energy, similar to the superficial energy invested in speech, which God, the Blessed Infinite One, produces in order to energize the universe. This external flow is referred to by scripture with the metaphor of breath of his mouth. Ruach piv is the Hebrew. As in the verse, it says that in Psalms from King David, and from the breath of his mouth, all the world's contents come to be. This breath refers to the divine energy, which is embodied in the spoken letters of the 10 statements in Genesis, through which the world was created. For the letters are, in fact, packages of divine energy, as has been explained in Tanya chapter 2, chapter 11, part 2, chapter 11. God created the world through 10 statements of divine speech recorded in Genesis 1. As we have explained in part 2 of Tanya, this speech represents creative energy. In fact, even the component letters of the speech are really packets of divine energy. The Torah describes this energy as speech, which is effortless and detached, to indicate less of an energetic investment on God's part when compared to the soul, which was produced by a deep blowing. So everything in the world that was created, including even the heavenly beings like the angels, were all created through the Ruach Piv, through the breath of his mouth, which is referring to speech. whereas the soul is coming from a deeper place, which is from a deep blowing of God, Nitzmat Chaim. Compared to this external superficial flow of energy, divine energy, which powers the universe, to the deep flow in the human soul. The energetic flow of the soul is the first emergence of a deep flow of divine energy produced by the blessed infinite one, which is the meaning of the verse, and God blew. In contrast to the divine energy which powers the universe, the soul energy is the first emergence and deep flow of divine energy. If God's connection with our souls is so profound, why do we not always feel it? So we just established that within our soul, it's literally a piece of, we are a chelik, Havaya. We have a piece of Havaya, which is the very makeup of our soul, because it comes from the deep breath of God, which is the inner part of God. So if we're so deeply rooted, why don't we feel it? So the Tanya explains, afterwards, the soul journeys downwards through the hidden places in the steps. It passes down through the spiritual worlds, process which masks its inner energy. The soul never loses its deep attachment with God, but the relationship does become veiled as the soul descends down from the heavens. And the soul is also channeled through the letters of the verbal statement, "Let us make man," to enter a body in this physical world. While the soul is rooted in the deep energy of God's glowing, it nevertheless has to pass through the filter of the more superficial energy of God's speech, because everything in the universe is created through divine speech. This is the meaning of the divine statement, "Let us make man." God took the high energy breath of the soul and filtered it through his lower energy speech. So something massive is happening right here. I just want to explain it just to make sure inside. We're already okay. Yeah, it just to explain this idea, even though the soul comes from an incredibly deep level, meaning from the deeper the deep root of the soul is that coming directly from God, meaning it's a very flow from God's energy, not through speech of God, which is an outer layer, but rather through the breath of God, which is the deeper part. Nonetheless, we don't fully feel it because of the process that it descends, is it gets veiled through speech. Like as God says when he created the world, he also, even though he breathed into man the breath of life, so which is the deeper part, but God also spoke and said, "Let us make man." So it had to go through the process of speech as well, which um, uh, basically veils the deep root and relationship between the soul and God. So the soul is rooted from the deeper place, from God's blowing energy, but yet it passes through the level of speech, which um, uh, um, veils the deeper relationship. So therefore, we don't feel it on a day-to-day basis. We have explained how the soul is rooted in God's most sacred name, the Tetragrammaton, based on the verse, "For God's portion are his people," Chelek Havai Amo, which is from Deuteronomy. This is in contrast to the rest of creation that is associated with the divine name Elokim, referring to God's power of restraint and diminishment. And that is why scripture will sometimes refer to the angels with the name Elokim, a name which usually refers to God. Elokim literally means judges. While it is a term which usually refers to God, Scripture occasionally uses Elohim to refer to angels, as the Tanya now demonstrates. As the verse states, "For God, your God, is the God of Elohim, Hu Elokei ha-Elohim, Hodu le'Elokei Elohim." As the verse states, "Give thanks to the God of Elohim." And the verse states, "The children of Elohim came to stand." The Tanya cites three verses corresponding to the angels in the three spiritual worlds of Bria, Yetzirah, and Asiyah. So here's a question. Why are the angels called Elohim? Because angels receive their energy from an external energetic flow from God, the mere letters of divine speech. And the divine name Elohim is external compared with the blessed name, divine name Havaya. The angels are derived from the diminished energy of God's speech. As a hint to this, they are sometimes referred to as Elohim, a name indicating a diminishment of divine energy. Man's soul, on the other hand, is from a deep divine energy. It is a portion of the divine name Havaya. And Havaya is a name that refers to a deep energy, which vastly transcends the level of divine letters of speech. So I went a little fast to make sure we get through section 2. I just want to explain this, especially this last idea, where we have God's tetragrammaton, which is what is we refer to in Hebrew as Havaya. It's the 4 letters comprising of a Yud, a Hey, a Vav, and a Hey. Now, when it refers to a soul and refers to the Jewish people, it refers to us as coming from a part of Havaya. Telek Havaya Amo. That a portion of Havaya is his people, which means we are a portion of Havaya. And our very makeup is the direct flow of energy from the name Havaya, which is the deeper name of God, because we come from the deeper, a deeper, higher source within God, which is like the idea of a breath, which is coming from the inner parts of a person. Whereas the rest of creation is coming from an outer layer, which is usually referred to as speech, which is how God created the world. Now, even angels are referred to with a lower name of God. So we have the name Havaya, which is a higher name of God, and we have the name Elohim, which is, I'm saying it with a kuf or with a K in there, not to say God's name, but it's really a hey. So it's Elohim, is how we refer to it in non-prayer terms. And the name Elohim is a lower name of God. And oftentimes you would see in the Torah, it refers to angels as Elohim. And actually over here, we just brought 3 sources, 3 verses that show it. But it's the idea that, and actually, in earlier in the book of Genesis, when it talks about the binding of Isaac, it says an angel of Elohim came to Abraham and told him not to offer his son. So it's called a malach Elohim. And sometimes the angel is not only referred to as malach Elohim, which is an angel of God, but it's referred to as Elohim, Elohim. So what we see is that the angel is coming from a lower level of godliness, a lower name of God, referred to as Elohim, whereas the soul is coming from a higher source, a deeper source, which is Havaya. That's one of the main points we're trying to bring out. Let's get through a practical lesson, which is on page 65 now. There is a radical difference between the divine energy invested in your soul and the divine energy invested in the rest of the universe. The energy in your soul is from deep within God, his breath. The energy in the rest of the universe is relatively superficial, like speech. Now, Hasidic thought is on page 67. This is from a letter of the Rebbe from 1953. And the Rebbe says as follows. Our sages said that each and every soul was in the presence of his divine majesty before coming down to this earth, and that the souls are hewn from under the seat of glory. These sayings emphasize the essential nature of the soul, its holiness and purity, and it's being completely divorced from anything material and physical. The soul itself, by its very nature, is not subject to any material desires or temptations. This is such a powerful idea. Just to explain a little bit more based on what we just read in the text, the soul originally comes from the deep root of Havaya, which is the breath of God that is from the inner part of God. But now, God also said, "Let us make man," which is God bringing even the soul into this world through speech, because even though we are from this deep part, our soul comes and is hewn from this under the seat of glory, which is a quote that the Rebbe just brought over here, and therefore it's not subject to distraction or limitations, but yet God veiled this capacity of the soul and this deep root, and I wouldn't say downgraded, but God made a tzimtzum and made the soul come into a world through speech. And therefore we are tempted, and therefore we don't feel the godly energy that we have so deeply at all times. And it's our job to be able to access it and to get deeper. Obviously, this is all going to be an intro now that we understand a little more about the soul, this is all an intro to explain to us the power of Teshuva. The power of Teshuva is to get back into that root, that deep root of our soul. So okay, so just to summarize what we learned, I think today was really powerful. We really have two very, very powerful questions that we asked. One question that we asked is, why is it that a person who commits terrible sins and during temple times would be punished by dying at the age of 50 or 60, which was a punishment from back then, even though now and then we don't have that punishment, but why is it that those people should live such happy, successful lives? We didn't answer that question yet, because in order to understand that question, we first have to understand the soul. We have to understand Teshuva, and in order to understand Teshuva, we have to understand the soul. So we started explaining the soul, and that the soul, like we said in chapter 2 of the first book of Tanya, the Sefer Shal Beinanim, the book of the in-betweener, we explained that the soul is coming literally from God. In Hebrew, the verse we said from Job was Telek Elokam Mimal, that the soul is a portion of God. I forgot how we translated it exactly. Um, Telek Elokam Mimal, and the Alter Rebbe adds the word mamash, which means literally a piece of God. And what we explained is that the soul is coming from the deeper name Havaya, which is where God breathes into us the breath of life, which is the deeper part of Hashem. And therefore, our soul directly is a piece of God, which obviously we have to take it delicately because we are not God, but we have godliness inside of us. That's obviously to say a person is God. That's borderline idolatry because we are not God. But we have a piece of God, as the verse in Deuteronomy says, Helek Havaya Amo, that portion of Havaya is his people, which means we are a portion of God, which means the name Havaya is what comprises our very soul, unlike the rest of creation, even angels that are coming from the speech of God. And therefore, like it says, an angel is referred to as Elohim, which is the lower name of God. And the soul, the neshama, is referred to as Havaya, Telek Havaya Amo, the name of the Tetragrammaton. So what we asked over here is, if we are from such a deep root, why don't we feel it? And we explained that's through the power of Tzimtzum, that God veiled this divine energy and made the soul come into this world also through the power of speech. Like God says in Genesis, let us make man. So God veiled this divine flow of energy. It's still there, but it's hidden and concealed, and therefore we don't feel it as it comes into this world. Okay, I think that's all we learned today. God willing, next week we're going to go into the very powerful idea of the name of Havaya and explaining how in those letters, Yud, Hey, Vav, and Hey, it actually is the power of God to create the world. And it goes through the Sefirot, the divine energies that creates the world, and how we see that in the letters of God's name. Okay.
I have two questions.
Yes, sure.
We can answer next week, but so yeah, so the first one is, I love that God says, let us make man, but how do we account for people that say there's all these humanoid or in between versions of until we became human? So that would be an interesting question, because if God created us a certain way, then what's the other stuff, whether it was evolution or whatever? So that's one question. And the other question is, if we're looking at the echad of the Adonai, as in the Shema, how are we, or do we even have the ability to separate the Elohim from the Havaya, because it's echad? So maybe we can talk about those two.
So absolutely. So the first question I'm not going to answer fully because it's actually, I read an article, I think on Chabad.org about humanoids. So I want to send it to you, Lynn, and
Please
then we
do.
could discuss it. But I'd rather first read that over and have you read it, and then we could talk about it. But the second one was there. I can't tell you how many thousands of pages of Chassidus talks about that verse of Shema and saying that our job is, and I think we learned this in Tanya. Yeah, and Shira, I'm going to get to the chat in a minute. I think we learned it in Tanya a few months ago that one of our main jobs is to make Elokim into Havaya. If you remember from Elijah with Mount Carmel, actually the last words we say on Yom Kippur, we say right before the sounding of the shofar. At the end of Yom Kippur, we say the verse of Shema one time, we say the Baruch Shem 3 times, and the ark is open, and we say the words Havaya Hu HaElokim, which is a verse from Elijah, taken from Mount Carmel, with the showdown with the false prophets, that Havaya is Elokim. But our job, over and over again, our main avodah, our main service, is to show in world how even the lower parts of divine energy in the world is really coming from the higher parts. And that's going to be part of our teshuva process to upgrade to that level. But if you remember, I think when we learned Shar Yichud V'Emunah, when we learned the gateway of unity and faith in God, one of the most incredible ideas was a tzaddik, their perception of world is all through Havaya. It is all through a higher plane of, they see everything as a spiritual component. Most of us see everything as an opportunity for godliness, but itself is more mundane, more physical. Our job is to make Elokim into Havaya, that to show Havaya Hu Elokim, that in everything in Elokim is really Havaya energy, that there's a really deep divine energy rooted in everything in life and in our soul. So we have that, but it's not always apparent. And our job in world is to uncover it. Our job in world is to unleash it, that power. So that's exactly like from the verse of Shema. If you remember, the main part of the last book of Shar Yichud V'Emunah was to explain that verse, and is referred to as Yehuda Ila'ah. The higher unity of God is to show as that Havaya and Elokim is all one. Then we explained there's a lower unity, which is the next verse of Baruch Shem, which is more from our perspective. Baruch means blessed, but it also means the way it's flowing into our world. So our job is to be able to have those the unity of God is uniting God himself, meaning God's names, that Havaya and Elokim is really all one. So yeah, Shira, I'll answer your question, and then Naomi, I'll answer your question as well. So you're asking about do only Jews have a piece of God in them? What about non-Jews? No, of course, everyone has a piece of God. There's neshama and there's nefesh. Everything in the world has a divine energy, and therefore, any human and not every living creature and even non-living creature has a divine energy. What we're referring to here is everything was created by God, and therefore there's a divine energy of godliness within everything, and everything has a soul referred to as a nefesh, which is that divine energy that you're referring to. But then we also have not only the nefesh or the divine energy, but what we're talking about is the piece of God of Havaya within a neshama, and that's unique to the Jewish people. Exactly that neshama, that deeper Havaya part, meaning everything has a piece of Elokim, even angels, right? The angels don't have Havaya in them; they come from Elokim, and everything and everyone has a divine energy. But the idea of Havaya, which is that neshama that we're referring to in chapter 2 of Tanya, that's a Jewish soul. Yes, Naomi.
Okay, I appreciate you clarifying that, because I had a question for quite a while similar to Shira's.
Yeah.
So that's a really good clarification about the difference between a Jewish soul and a non-Jewish soul.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Awesome. All right. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.
Thank you.
And we'll see you next week, everyone. Chodesh
Thank
Tov.
you.
Thank you. Bye.